So we're focusing on history tonight. I'll touch on the seven councils a little bit, but we'll go very beginning up to pretty much present day. So from the very beginning, even before Paul, converted, had his experience, there was structure, there was organization within the church. So the apostles, the other apostles, were cautious when they first heard about Paul, because he was the guy that was, as they say, breathing murderous threats, arresting people and all that stuff. And so Paul had his experience. Then he went in off to Arabia, and basically solitary to probably think through what had happened. And when he came back, he met with James, who was like basically the bishop of Jerusalem. And he had to prove himself, because you got this guy that's, was arresting people, and now he's saying that he's part of us. So he had to show that he was who he claimed to be. So Jerusalem was really the foundation, was like the center of Christianity, which makes sense because that's where Christ did a lot of his teaching. And within a few decades, the gospel began to spread around the Mediterranean. And so we read about Antioch in the book of Acts, and it became like the second branch of the church. This was probably before 40, the 80 40. And then Rome is interesting because when you read about Pentecost, they name off a whole bunch of different areas, and Rome is one of those. They say people from Rome, or Jews from Rome, had come to hear. So we know that Rome wasn't just like started by Peter, as the Roman Church likes to say. There was people that even at Pentecost had heard the gospel and probably took it back with them and shared it. And we know, the book of Romans was written by Paul. So, and Peter was initially founded in Antioch. So really Antioch has first claim to him. So a fair bit of what Rome says isn't exactly honest. So, and that Rome became a center of power probably somewhere around 42. And then the Apostle Mark started the church in Alexandria around 49. So there was already, within about 15 years, there was already an established structure to the church. It wasn't just a bunch of loosely connected congregations kind of figuring out as they go. We see from the apostles, they travel somewhere, they preach the gospel, they'd get response, and they would travel to the next place, and then they'd go back and preach again, and more people would come, and they would choose men to lead, to be in charge of these different congregations, different parishes. And so it wasn't just, here's the gospel, go figure it out. Within less than probably 35 years, the Apostle Andrew went to the Slavic people, Russia kind of area. Thomas went as far as India, preaching the gospel. Philip went to North Africa. Matthew was in Persia and Ethiopia. Bartholomew was in Armenia, which, interestingly, Armenia is actually the first nation to officially adopt Christianity. That was way, way back. Jude was in Lebanon. James went to Syria. Simon went to Persia. Matthias was in Syria as well. John, of course, Asia Minor, in Greece. And then Peter and Paul, all around the Mediterranean. And then, like I said, Mark in Egypt, Alexandria. So within 4 decades, you have these guys going that far. The gospel was moving really quick and covering a lot of ground. So by the year 70, all of the apostles except for John had been martyred. So, and John died of old age before 100. They don't exactly when, but that's right around there. So as time passed, the next generation of leaders did their best at continuing what the apostles had taught them. But as Paul warned, there will be false teachers who are going to mislead the church. So Paul understood the man's nature and the how easy it is to slip into, well, I think this is the way it should be kind of thinking. So like we saw for the next 300 years after Pentecost, confusion, arguments about who's Jesus, what are we doing here, what's the purpose of the church, and the church leadership worked really hard at articulating what the church had always believed and practiced. So when people like to argue that, so a bunch of guys got together and just made up these doctrines talking about the 7 councils, but the best answer is they didn't just make these things up. They were looking at the last several hundred years of this is what the church has always believed and practiced. We're not just making this up. We're not just pretending to know these things. So even though the 4 Gospels were in circulation, there was many other writings as well. You've heard about the Gospel of Thomas and these different teachings, and there's a reason those were left out. The fathers of the church were very careful about, okay, this writing contains something that's not quite right, so we're going to exclude it. So in the early days, when people would write, they would often just take an author's name and, like, we'll say, the Apostle John wrote this, because and it wasn't considered plagiarism. Their thought was, well, this is what I think he meant. This is kind of written in his spirit. So they would sign his name as almost like an honorific, really. So beginning in 325, the actual ecumenical councils started. There'd been many councils and synods beforehand, but they were usually local based. Like an area would be struggling with a particular belief or some sort of oddity was going on, so they would gather and discuss it and work through and make a proclamation. But the ecumenical councils were specifically meant to be applicable to the entire church. This is what the church practices and believes. This applies to everybody. And if you're outside of that, then you're not basically practicing faithful Christianity. So for the next 450 years, they went through so much argumentation, so much debate, and for the most part, the ecumenical councils were about the nature and person of Christ. So some people said he was just a man, like the rest of the prophets. Some said he was God-like, or that God adopted him, so he was divine for a short time. Some people said he was physically a man, but he also had just a divine nature and not a human nature, which doesn't work, because if he was only, that would make him like half God and half man. So you can't, as they say, you can't redeem what you're not. So 325, First Council, they were specifically addressing Arius, who said that Jesus was not God, he was just a guy, and that's where we get the term Arianism. The Second Council in 381, again, needed to condemn Arius, and the question of, if there's a God the Father and God the Son, how can there be 2 gods if there's only one God? So they were wrestling with this. What does that even mean, that there's two gods? So the third council, 431, was about what's the appropriate label for Mary. Some said the Theotokos, which means the God bearer, and others argued it should be the Christotokos, which means the Messiah bearer. So there was a distinction there of, one says he's God, one says he's just a guy taking care of something for the nation of Israel. So the council landed on, we need to call Mary the Theotokos because Christ is God. The fourth council in 451 was dealing with monophysitism, so the idea that Christ had only one nature. So going back to that old argument of human body, divine nature. And the council determined that Jesus is truly God and truly man, so therefore he has two natures. And they work in perfect harmony. And Jesus is eternally begotten of the Father. So this idea of being eternally begotten it's a little hard to grasp because God never changes. Christ is always coming forth from the Father, so it's like a perpetual coming forth. However, there's nothing in creation we can appeal to explain it, because God is God and creation is not. The fifth council in 553 didn't cover anything new. It was more just reconfirming the previous councils and condemning those related heresies. The sixth council in 680, so that was the biggest gap, about 130 years past, was debating, did Jesus have one or two energies? Did he have one or two wills? And they said, going back to the fact that Christ is fully God and fully man, he has two energies and he has two wills. So to take one of those away from him would be to either take away his divinity or take away his humanity. But he is fully God and fully man. And it was during this council that Islam appeared. As they say, Muhammad probably ate some bad sardines in the desert and had these weird visions. So the arrival of Islam caused all kinds of issues for the church. And then the seventh council in 787 was about the use of icons. So mainly it was the government and the military that didn't like the icons. They felt that it was some sort of idolatry. Fortunately, the majority of the churches and the monasteries protected the icons. There was times when an abbot would say to his monks, gather up as many as you can get, run to the hills, get away, go into hiding so we can protect these. And unfortunately, many icons were destroyed or burned or whatever. So you think about what a tragedy that is to have, say, an icon that was painted in 1 or 200. If we had that today, how glorious that would be. So the use of icons teaches us two things. First, Jesus is truly man, so he can be imaged. So like, if he wasn't really a person, then you couldn't paint a picture of him, you couldn't take a photo of him, whatever. And then second, the saints that have reposed, they're not locked away in death. They're not held in the grave like man used to be. But they've been glorified, and the icons show them in their perfected state. They are in the presence of God, and they are still part of the body of Christ. So when we look at icons, these are not meant to be like photographic representations, like, well, this is exactly what Pantaleimon looked like or whatever. It's these people have been glorified, they've been perfected, they're now in God's presence. And a common thought within the church, within Protestantism or the evangelical churches, is that there's the church triumphant and the church active. So basically they do this dividing of people that have died are off somewhere else. Like I had a Protestant pastor say to me, well, why do you pray to saints? You know, why do you think they can hear you? It's like, well, we're one church. There's no division. They're part of the body as we are the part of the body. So throughout this whole time, 325 to 787, the Church of Rome was geographically a good distance away from the others, and that caused problems for communication and such. So Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople, even though all of the bishops were equals, they did give Rome higher honor, as appealing back to Peter being the rock upon which the church is built. Rome misinterprets that, but so during this whole time, the church in Rome rose and fell in favor. There was times when there was quite a division between the East and the West, and then Rome was very early on started developing this idea of the Pope, the Patriarch of Rome, should be the head of everything. Everybody should submit to him as the authority. And everybody else was like, no, we've never believed that. We've never done that. We'll give you higher honor, but you're still one of the five. They call that the ancient patriarchates. So those five. So going back to Islam, it was a huge problem. The speed at which Islam rose was remarkable. They went from a grouping, dozens or scores of individual separate tribes with their own gods, and Allah was just one of the gods of one of these tribes, and Muhammad somehow convinced them that Allah was the God and they all needed to submit to him. And people rarely talk about how he managed to pull this off, because basically they resorted to robbing people. So basically they would hide and travelers would go by and they'd rush out and steal all their stuff, and that's how they financed Islam initially. And Muhammad, I think, only lived like 30 years from the point that he started it to when it rose to power. So eventually Islam started taking over huge sections of land, entire towns, and at some point Antioch and some of the other big cities fell to Islam, and that obviously was a problem for the Eastern Church, because they were losing ground, they were losing people, they were losing freedom. And interesting, the Eastern Church said at one point, we would rather be under the yoke of Islam than be under the yoke of Rome. Which is, there's some real wisdom in that, because there's something called almost right theology, where the closer someone is to being part of the truth, but they're not quite there, it's really hard to protect like the next generation from that, because there's these little subtle nuances that they sneak in, which Rome was doing. But Islam is obviously wrong, because you could just say, well, they deny the deity of Christ, so they're clearly outside of the church. So the danger of almost right theology is a serious error, a serious issue that more people need to be attentive to.
It's more like deceptive.
Yeah, it's like a form of deception, really. So this puts us at about the 9th century, so the 800s. In Constantinople, there was two brothers, Cyril and Methodius, and they were known as the apostles to the Slavs, to the Slavic people, and we give them the title equal to the apostles because of the great work that they did. Both of them were highly educated. Cyril was a professor of philosophy at the university in Byzantium. And Methodius was very involved in politics, and he was also the abbot of a monastery. So you got these two very gifted, highly trained, highly educated men. And a prince from within the Slavic region reached out to the patriarch and said, "Can you send some missionaries? We want to know more about the gospel." And so when Cyril and Methodius got there, they were not the first, because the Romans had been there before. And the prince declared, basically told them, "We've rejected our paganism, and we are basically driving the Romans out. We don't want them here. So we want to be in alignment with Byzantium." So Cyril and Methodius, in a very wise move, they created an alphabet for the Slavs, and basically they knew that if you try to come in like the Romans do it and impose your culture on them, it's not going to work. So they came in, they learned the language, they created the alphabet, they translated the Bible into that new language alphabet for them. And they also helped them develop Slavic civil code. So instead of imposing Byzantine law or Roman law upon them, they took what the people already had and helped them organize it, put it into a written code. So, and this is where Church Slavonic comes from, which we use in our services. So, two things brought the Eastern Church into the Slavic region. So that was the prince driving Rome away, and then inviting Cyril and Methodius in, and then their using of the Slavic language to help build up and Christianize their culture, not impose a foreign culture on them, saying, like Rome has done this many, many times throughout history. South America was horrible, what they did down there, trying to impose English law on a bunch of natives that had no clue what a chalkwig was. So, less than 100 years later, Prince Vladimir of Russia, he sent representatives to Byzantium, and he wanted to learn about, because he'd been hearing bits and pieces from the Slavic people about Christianity, and he sent his representatives there. And when they came back, their phrase was, "We've seen heaven." So being in the Divine Liturgy was just unbelievable. It's like, this is so beauteous, this is so glorious. And it was then that Vladimir chose to embrace the faith and basically Christianize his nation. So as early as 867, there'd been talk of Christianity through Byzantine in Russia. And it was in 988 that Prince Vladimir was baptized. And he officially embraced the Christian faith for his nation. And he rather violently eliminated the paganism that was so common. So he had 12 sons whom he baptized. He tore down the pagan churches, and there was their main god was went by the name of Perun, Perun, and he was like the Slavic version of Thor. So he was the god of thunder and lightning, and the wings on the helmet and all that sort of thing. And so when he officially embraced Christianity, he tore that altar down and threw it in the Dnieper River as a big public declaration. We have nothing to do with paganism anymore. So in a move that really should be copied, the church has done fairly well with this over time. The place that was holy to this god Perun was converted into an Orthodox monastery. It was near Veliki Novgorod. So the church has done this. Rome did it with Easter. So Easter was a pagan holiday, and they basically said, we're going to start celebrating the resurrection on that day. They did it with Christmas. Christmas used to be Saturnalia, another pagan holiday, December 25. They decided that if we start celebrating Christ's birth on that day, and it worked, they slowly overshadowed the paganism of that. And there's been other, I wish they would have done with Halloween, but they dropped the ball on that one. So there's some stories that as early as the 1st century, the Apostle Andrew brought the gospel basically right up to the very edge of the Slavic people. And so it was heard of, they had familiarity with the gospel. And then in the 4th century, the gospel was brought into Crimea, and they've actually unearthed churches, Orthodox churches, from that far back in that region. So when we talk about Holy Rus, we're saying Russia, Kiev, or Ukraine, and Belarus is considered Holy Rus. So there was actual Orthodox churches in those areas in the 4th century. So eventually, Holy Rus aligned itself with the Byzantine Empire, and that was a really good move because it basically gave the Russians someone wise to look to for guidance and direction. The last thing you want to be doing is trying to figure out things on your own. So having Byzantium there was a great help for spiritual growth and maturity. So the Great Schism of 1054, this was not just a one-time event. It wasn't a, like, out of the blue, Rome's going to break off and do their own thing. So that, like I said, for centuries before, Rome had been toying with this idea of the Roman patriarch should be the head, everybody should submit to him. And finally, in 1054, they basically threw down the gauntlet and said, everybody needs to submit to us. And then they also added this extra phrase to the Nicene Creed. And the rest of Christendom, again, disagreed with them and said, you can't just be adding just willy-nilly whatever you want to, something that's been our foundation for centuries. So this resulted in Pope Leo IX excommunicating Patriarch Michael of Constantinople. And Michael basically said, oh yeah, well, I'm going to excommunicate you too then. So that was the big rift. That was the Great Schism. The additional problem that Rome had was the influence of pagan and Aryan Germanic tribes far to the north coming in. Because they had such military power, they were pushing Rome in the wrong direction, and they were kind of controlling what the church there was doing. They somewhat turned the Roman Church into a semi-political power. So instead of there being the distinction of the emperor handling civil issues and the patriarch handling religious, Rome kind of turned into this blend, which got really ugly within about 50 years. So when you look at what happened with Rome, they like to say, oh, we're the true historic church, you guys left. But if you think about it, does one leave four, or does four leave one? That'd be like an NFL team saying, well, we're the NFL now, everybody else is something else. That doesn't make sense. One guy doesn't make up that reality. Mm-hmm. So technically speaking, with this Great Schism, Constantinople became the second Rome, but practically they'd held second honor already, even for centuries back, with the rise and fall of Rome's being in favor and out of favor. The other patriarchs looked to Constantinople for guidance. So the main point that Rome seemed to be missing was that each historical seat had a bishop that was an equal with all the others. That was how it was set up. We know that people are power hungry, that people are corrupt, that people will take advantage of an opportunity if they have it. And we can see that with Rome. They wanted to be the number one. They wanted everybody to submit to them. And somewhere along the line, the Patriarch of Rome turned into the Pope of Rome. I guess maybe, well, we see it in the United States too. You take a label and you redefine it, and then you can make people believe whatever you want them to believe. And he also had this delusion of ultimate authority. So, like I said, within 50 years, this weird combination of religious authority and political authority came to a head with the Crusades. So, Islam was, like I said, causing a lot of problems for the East. And they had taken Jerusalem, and Rome went in, military power, to try to take that city back. And because so many Christians were blended in with Islamic people, and for the most part they lived in peace, it was fine. I think the Christians got taxed more than the Muslims. But when that first crusade happened, many Christians were killed as well, as they were trying to overthrow and get Jerusalem back. So the Crusades technically ended in 1291, but they kind of continued for another 400 years. So it was on and off. So suffice to say, this was not a good period of history. So a church calling itself Christian, coming in, slaughtering entire towns, promising indulgences to military leaders. So basically, if you go off and fight in the Crusades and kill a bunch of Muslims, you get an automatic ticket to heaven. That's basically what they were saying. So something's clearly wrong with a situation like that. And we're not just talking like, come in and kill somebody. It was horrific butchering that was going on. So in a sense, you could say that the Eastern Church suffered under the rule of Islam, because Islam didn't like the images, they didn't like the idea of calling what they considered a man a god. But at the same time, the Eastern Church was protected from the oppression and the errors of Rome as well. So having this bad theology under one guy that was trying to dominate the entire world was not something the East wanted to put up with. So jump ahead, the 1300s, the hesychastic controversy. So hesychasm is, technically the word means inner quiet or stillness. And the idea is to be silent on your inner person and be practicing the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And the idea is to focus on that and not allow other thoughts to come in and distract you, which is really difficult. It takes probably decades to get to the point where you can actually silence yourself. So you hear stories about monastics going into seclusion and doing the Jesus prayer for 30, 40, 50 years before they conquer their inner noise. And Gregory Palamas was the one that was kind of the spearhead of this debate, controversy that was going on. So he didn't invent this idea of inner prayer. Maximus the Confessor, way back in 600, was talking about it. St. Simeon, the New Theologian, around 1000, was talking about it as well. And you see hints of it in the earliest writings of focusing on Christ, or just the name of Jesus is oftentimes something that people will do. There's some who suggest certain ways of sitting when you do the Jesus prayer, or certain breathing techniques that are used. But for the most part, it's really just about not being distracted, about focusing on Christ, about communing with God, and not having, so what's for dinner tonight, or that movie scene from a movie you saw, coming in and muddying your mind. So the Saint Porphyrios of Mount Athos, I think he was canonized in 1992. He was very much against this idea of techniques or breathing. He says, just focus on God. Just, don't be distracted by so much of the craziness that's out there. So the debate over this hesychasm had to do with the essence and energies of God, and the Palamos argued that we cannot know the essence of God, because basically he is beyond our comprehension, but we can know his energies, we can know his works, what he's doing. And he was a monk on Athos, and the church in Rome was aggressively opposed to this idea of hesychasm, of being silent. And there was a philosopher by the name of Barlaam from Italy, and it was the two of them, so Gregory Palamas and Barlaam, had the initial debate over how, really the question was, how do we know God? It wasn't so much East versus West, it was an approach to theology. So hesychasm argued that God could be experienced through his energies, but not his essence, while the West argued that God can only be known through scripture and tradition, so signs and symbols. They argued that the divine light that hesychasts claimed to be able to see was not the uncreated light, but a created one. And in a council in 1341, the hesychast position was upheld. And at that point, Barlaam retired. He basically said, I've had enough of this. I'm done arguing. But other men stepped in and continued arguing for him. So even though these two men agreed that God is unknowable, Palamos knew that you can't just stop there, because Christianity is about the relationship between God and man. So you can't just say, well, we can't know God, because knowing God is what the faith is. So he distinguished between essence and energies. And this is what we see on Mount Tabor. So when Christ basically glowed with a white light, some of the apostles saw that. And we understand that to be the uncreated light that they saw. So some people argue that Barlaam basically saw the error of his ways and embraced the Orthodox faith, and then basically went into isolation, basically became an Orthodox monk. And the East has argued that hesychasm is a path for everybody. It's not just for monks. Everybody should be seeking after God in this way. And the West, of course, rejected it. They didn't accept the findings of this council, and they've continued with their overly academic, Thomistic approach to the Christian faith, wanting to define and articulate everything. So the big question is, we can relate to God. We can experience him through his energies, not through his essence, because it's that creator-creature distinction is there. It's beyond what we can understand. So jump ahead another 150 years, 1453, the fall or the conquest of Constantinople. So basically, when this happened, this was in essence the end of the Roman Empire. So the walls of Constantinople were considered the greatest and the strongest in history, and they were eventually overcome by the Ottoman Empire, so the Muslims, and they had 1,000-pound cannonballs that they were shooting towards these walls. So you can imagine the damage something like that would do. So the city was consecrated in 330 by Constantine, and it held its place for almost 900 years. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Rome actually overthrew Constantinople, which seems rather odd considering they're both Christian groups. And they tried to come in and impose Roman everything like Rome does, and it failed. The people just wouldn't have it. And within about 50 years, the Byzantines took it back. So in 1261 is when they took it back. Things started going downhill from that point. In 1346, the Black Plague hit, and they lost literally half of their inhabitants to this disease. And then, of course, losing that kind of a population, the economy tanked, and things just continued to get worse. And the Ottoman Empire saw an opportunity, so they started moving closer, building cities closer, and eventually, they pretended to be friendly, pretended to be nice, probably what China's doing to us right now. And eventually, the Ottoman Empire controlled all sea traffic through the Bosphorus. And when the East saw what was going on, basically our population is getting smaller and smaller, and the Ottomans are getting closer and closer, and they're controlling. They reached out to the West, basically, Rome, can you help? And there was ethnic hatred and diversity and disdain there for each other, and the whole thing fell apart. Rome said, too bad, you're on your own. So when the Ottomans finally attacked, Constantinople only had 7,000 defenders, so 7,000 soldiers, 2,000 of which were foreigners, so people that had come from Slavic lands or Russia or whatever to help. Whereas the Ottomans had somewhere between 50 and 70,000 soldiers, so 8 to 10 times what Constantinople had. In a really bad situation, there was a Hungarian scientist. He built a 27-foot long cannon, and it could shoot a 600-pound cannonball for over a mile. And so he presented it to Constantinople, and they're like, we can't afford it. We don't have enough money to pay you. So he sold it to the Ottomans. Oops. So the Constantinople had 22 miles of outer wall to protect, and with 7,000 total soldiers, you're not going to protect much with that few people. So only within 53 days, the Ottomans breached the wall, basically had broke through several places, flooded in, and they killed some, but their goal was not wanton slaughter. They wanted slaves. So basically they killed a few and then started taking people into slavery, looting, taking everything of value, burning down Orthodox churches, destroying anything that looked like a cross.
Is that where the Hagia Sophia is?
Yeah.
And is that around the time it converted to a...
Yeah, that's exactly when. So the Hagia Sophia was like the gem of Orthodoxy. It was this beautiful cathedral. And when the Ottomans overthrew the city, that was the first place they went. And they actually killed thousands of people inside the Hagia Sophia. And then painted over the icons, tore other icons down, took down crosses, all that kind of stuff. So it was a museum for a long time. It was a mosque for a while. And I think it's a mosque right now, if I remember And really sadly, a lot of historians say that when that overthrow and enslavement happened, the people were treated better by the Ottomans than their ancestors were when Rome overthrew them, which really paints Rome in a bad picture. So, the Fourth Crusade, Rome killed, abused, all those things to their own, basically their brothers in Christ. So we see, you had Christ crucified, most of his people abandoned him. People on the road to Emmaus, they were leaving, they're like, I guess we were wrong, Jesus isn't who he said he was, who we thought he was. And then he rises from the dead, he appears to hundreds of people, and then the gospel just explodes in Russia, India, Africa, all through as far east as Spain. So the gospel spread huge, wide into what was the known world at that point. And the Great Schism happens. Rome gets this idea about grand authority. Constantinople becomes the second Rome, and then when it fell, Moscow stepped in and really became the third Rome. So where the East was essentially lost to the Muslims, Russia stepped in and created another great Orthodox power for the world. So just like in Byzantium, you had the emperor and the patriarch working hand in hand, moving the gospel into the culture, Christianizing the people. This is what happened in Moscow as well. You had the patriarch and the emperor there working together, Christianizing their culture. So in the 1400s, an attempt was made to reunite Moscow with Rome, and Prince Vasily of Moscow rejected this. He's like, no, we don't want anything to do with Rome. We can see the path they've taken. So in 1448, the Russian Church became independent of the Patriarch of Constantinople, considering that Constantinople is really small and that whole area was predominantly Muslim at this point. So when he took that title, Jonas, Patriarch Jonas, he was called the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus. And within a very short time, that changed to the Metropolitan of Moscow and all Rus. So in the 3rd century, the deserts of Egypt basically filled up with monastics. So when Christianity was legalized early on by Constantine, a bunch of people, their fear was, now that it's legal, it's going to be very easy to be a Christian. And we don't want that. We don't want things getting watered down. So they fled to the deserts to struggle with their faith. And that's basically what happened with Russia as well. They didn't have deserts in Russia. They fled into the wild, untamed northern forests where it was cold and rainy and overgrown. And so you really had a second Egypt, you could say, in northern Russia. So many, many monasteries were formed. These places became places of pilgrimage. Many, many holy monks. Saint Seraphim of Sarov was a huge influence. A lot of monks were a big influence on the people of Rus. So, unfortunately, in the 1800s, Russia formed a relationship with France, and France really started pulling Russia in the wrong direction. So it was, if you've ever read War and Peace, you get this description of these very soft, pretty people in Russia being influenced by France. And it ended up becoming this two-party culture. So you had the ultra wealthy, the princes with their grand wealth, and then all the common people, which led up to the rise of Soviet communism, which fortunately only lasted about 70 years. Bad ideas tend to fail after a while. So even though there was 20 million people killed, mostly priests and Orthodox Christians, with the rise of communism, when communism died, when it shriveled, Orthodoxy sprang back up and came back to life. And the Orthodox world, the Orthodox view, was so ingrained in Russian culture for so long that no communism was going to quash it. So even now, churches that were destroyed or being rebuilt, churches that were repurposed, you hear about a certain church being turned into a stable, like just move the animals in there and that sort of thing. These are being restored and being brought back. So before all that happened, before the rise of communism, Russia began sending monastics into Alaska. So 1794, Father Herman, with a group of other monks, basically followed the fur traders into Alaska and thought, okay, there's people there. There's, because this is an opportunity to continue growing the church. And like Cyril and Methodius, when they came into Alaska, they basically became part of that Alaskan culture. They didn't try to impose Russian life on them. They didn't try to impose a foreign culture, foreign beliefs. So within 30 years, Father Innocent, Father Innocent was remarkable. If you get the chance, read his biography. He was really, really an amazing person. So 1823 is when he came into Alaska, and he realized that the natives don't really have any kind of organized religion, and they, as they began to mingle, the natives realized this Orthodox you're talking about really fits with who we are, because they had a big emphasis on chastity, on patience, on silence, and on a respect for elders. So they were, in a sense, you could say their culture developed in a way that caused them to blend nicely with the Orthodox faith. So, like Cyril and Methodius, Innocent created a written language for the Alaskans. Schools were established. They translated the Bible into their own language, giving them something visual instead of just a verbal communication. Innocent was a remarkable scientist. He actually built clocks when he was there. He eventually became a bishop. He kept records of everything, weather patterns, when flooding happened, all these kind of things. And he actually saved a species of seal from going extinct because I think it was the Russians were overhunting them, driving them close, and he realized what was going on, and he intervened and brought that back. So with this invention of the language, with translating the Bible into their language, initially natives were being sent into Russia to go to seminary, and they realized, okay, they're having to travel thousands of miles to get this education. Why don't we just build a seminary here? So they did that, and church service books started being written in the Alaskan tongue, and even today, if you go up there, there's a predominant Orthodox culture feel with those people. So with Russia coming in from the north and west, they eventually filtered down through Washington, Oregon, into California. On the East Coast, you had the Greeks and the Serbians coming in, usually through immigration. And with immigration, you bring your culture. And as more people flooded in to America, unfortunately, the Greeks, and it's understandable, they wanted to be, we're Americans too, we're not some weird bunch of people. And so they started modifying things with the church. So they put pews in, which doesn't work with the Divine Liturgy. There's less icons in Greek churches, I've noticed. And unfortunately, that's had a lasting impact on the Greek church in the U.S. So the first Orthodox church in the continental U.S. was built in 1868 in San Francisco. And then the second one was built in New York in 1870. So you had the Russian over here and then the Greek over there. So from that next 100 years, the Orthodox Church was seen as, oh, they're like weird Catholics or something, or they're some sort of ethnic thing that people didn't get. Until 1970s, when a group of American pastors, a lot of them were youth with a mission people, and they started gathering together, and they're like, something's wrong with American Christianity. It's so new, it seems so American. And so they started studying, they started reading, they found the church fathers, and they're working through this, and they got to the point where they said, we're just gonna have to start something that's like faithful to what the church was in the past. And one of these men, Father Mel Jamaica, was my priest when I was in Everson, and so basically my becoming part of that church was basically ground level for Orthodoxy in America. So these men, after studying all this, eventually they figured out, wait a minute, the Orthodox Church that we see in these different ethnic groups, this is what they're practicing, this is what they're believing. So they approached the Greek church first, and the Greek church is like, no, we're not interested. We don't want a bunch of Americans like that, which is strange. And so then they went to the Antiochian Patriarchate, and the Antiochians were like, yes, come join. And they had this mass baptism, hundreds and hundreds of people. And there was actually several congregations that joined in mass. In Arlington, on the west coast of Washington, there was a Lutheran church, I think. And when the pastor started pushing his congregation that way, about half of them left. So that half left, and the other half stayed as a congregation, and then they joined as a whole. And so the church converted from Lutheran to Orthodox. So that really started, you could say, the ball rolling for Orthodoxy in the United States. It became, on one hand, that's a good thing, that it became more well known, but on the other hand, it was starting to get Americanized. So when communism struck, when communism rose up, there was Russian churches outside of Russia, and these became distinct in a sense as Rokor, so Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. And there was a number of those in the U.S., as well as the Moscow Patriarchate, which we are. And then it was decided at one point that, so we've got this uneasy relationship. There's there's the Russian church, there's ROCOR, there's a bunch of Americans that are part of these Russian churches. So the OCA was formed, the Orthodox Church of America, and they were given the option, a congregation, so you can either join the Moscow Patriarchate or you can become OCA. And I think most of them became OCA. So the OCA doesn't really have an ethnic flavor to it like all the other churches do. Mostly Euro-American people go to OCA churches. There's a few Russian, Bulgarian, Georgian, Polish, Serbian, Czech, and Slovakian parishes. So there are some that are more ethnic than others. Some patriarchates recognize the OCA as legitimate, but the Patriarch of Constantinople does not. So it's probably, well, I shouldn't speculate, but I think Constantinople is sore that Russia broke off of them and basically kind of took over and started making decisions on their own. So I'm guessing that's why they don't recognize the OCA as legitimate. The trouble with Americans is they tend to move too fast. So here we've been a country for 250 years and we're already failing. And the OCA wants to be their own independent Orthodox church. But it's like having a 4-year-old and giving him the keys of the car and saying, yeah, go for it. You know, that's not going to end well. The OCA is far too young to be taking the lead. They should be submitting to a bishop, a metropolitan, a patriarch, someone over them for leadership, for guidance. Too much freedom too soon is just dangerous.
So they're like trying to have their own bishop or something?
There's been this debate for decades, I think, of, you know, basically there needs to be an American Orthodox church, and basically we'll just convert them all into OCA, was what some people want. And most people are like, no thanks, you know, you Americans are, that's not going to work. Mm-hmm. So the other aspect that's causing a lot of trouble is the Protestantism, the American evangelicalism that's seeping in to Orthodoxy within these American churches. It's difficult unless you're very, very cognizant of the influence of these foreign beliefs. It's very, very difficult to weed them out, to not allow them to influence our thinking. That's why it's so important to read the early church fathers. Because when we look to, there's so many American priests that are writing books, you know, they're writing doctrinal treatises and stuff on orthodoxy, when they don't realize how much their former beliefs or baggage on them are influencing them. So we need to be looking at the church fathers. We shouldn't be trying to innovate. We shouldn't be trying to Americanize what the church is doing. So, so the first century of Christendom, the gospel exploded. Spain, Europe, Russia, India, Africa. It was exploding everywhere. Islam rose up, caused a lot of problems. Rome split, caused even more problems. And then it's interesting when you look at when a split happens like that, it never just stays. It's not like it goes into two branches. It's not like Rome just stayed. Rome split. 500 years later, it split again with the Protestants in 3 branches, and then a 4th with Anglicanism. And then those just exploded, and there's like 20,000 denominations now, and none of them agree on anything. So when a split happens, things get ugly. It's because you're introducing an error. So it's like building a building, right? If you're off by 1 degree, by the time you get to the 10th floor, You're going to be looking down from your window. So, and it's not just Christianity. Islam, you've got the Sunnis and the Shiites, and they're fighting. Buddhism doesn't have a definitive belief system. There's at least 3 different schools of thought within Buddhism. And Hinduism, they've got, I think I've heard close to 1 million gods that they venerate. It's crazy. They have a god for everything. The god of right angles and weird, very strange. But yeah, if you read Hinduism, it's a completely different worldview, and their multiplicity of gods makes sense when you understand where they're coming from. So, the history of Orthodoxy has been one of unchanging belief and unchanging practice. When we look to the first several centuries, it was not, like I said, guys just making stuff up with what they liked. It was Jesus taught the apostles taught the next generation, and those beliefs were handed down. And we can trust that the Holy Spirit has been guiding us, that the gates of hell will not prevail over the church. So what we believe, what we practice has been the same since the beginning. When our divine liturgy, the one we use 90% of the time, was formulated by John Chrysostom. And at the time that he articulated that, there was many others that were very, very similar. And the church fathers looked at all these and decided we're all basically saying the same thing, but I think Chrysostom's is probably the most articulate. So there wasn't this huge diversity of these guys were doing one thing and these guys were doing another. They were all basically the same, worshiping the same way. So, and when Chrysostom wrote this, it wasn't just out of the blue. He didn't just make it up. It was a pattern that had been developing for a long time. So you could probably say that our way of worshiping is probably at least 1,800 years old. So our faith is unchanging belief and practice, regardless of whatever nation or ethnic group embraces it. So you can go anywhere in the world where there's a divine liturgy, and even if you don't know the language, you can get into the flow of it. You can know that we're worshiping as one body.
Was the like Bolshevik thing with the royal family, was that like before the communism thing, or like the same time? Or?
That was at the very beginning of it. Yeah, yeah. The royal family was dabbling in some things they probably shouldn't have been. Like with what's his name? Rasputin.
Cult a little bit.
Yeah. I don't know what you would call it. I think he just kind of made things up as he went. That was the very beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution.
I was gonna say about Islam, like what impacts did it leave on our church in the East or Eastern Orthodox? Like what did they major impacts?
So
or problems?
Yeah, so Islam overthrew huge areas of land, entire cities that were predominantly Orthodox, and Islam is violently opposed to any kind of images. So we lost many icons, we lost many churches, even being able to display the cross. So I'm sure many people were killed as well because of their faith. But like the original Ottoman Empire, when they overthrew Constantinople, they weren't looking to kill; they just wanted slaves. So a lot of the Orthodox people were enslaved and lost that freedom of worship, having to go underground, having to hide their faith. So, but ultimately, Islam didn't impact our belief or practices at all.
Mhm.
It just made it more difficult.
You said one of the first Orthodox churches in America was in San Francisco, yeah?
Yeah, 1868.
And was that the Holy Virgin Cathedral or a different one?
I was going to look that up, but I didn't. I'm not sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
Check it out.
Well, would you say technically like Catholics and like Muslims, like their theology is kind of like, how do you say? I won't say an enemy or something, but like I don't know what's the right word to say it. Like it kind of like interferes with our belief or something. Like
No, the Islam and Catholicism are, I should say, Islam and the Roman Church. They're very much at odds. So where Rome didn't embrace icons like we have,
yeah,
they're not necessarily opposed to them. They just don't view them the same way that we do. Whereas Islam is violently opposed to that, and of course Islam denies Christ's deity.
mm-hmm.
So there was enough debate and arguing between the East and the West that lines were drawn. So and since the Great Schism, Rome has been inventing and adding new doctrine and new beliefs, which the East rejects. So like Islam, Rome has not controlled or directed our practice or belief.